Hey, welcome everyone. Sorry for the delay. We are excited today because we're going to be talking about a really important topic that every gardener faces and usually gets really frustrated about, and that's how to beat the weeds. And usually that involves a lot of hard work, but my friend John Moody has done a lot of study and a lot of testing and a lot of implementation and has learned more than a few tricks on how to accomplish the task of beating the weeds without all the hard work. So we're going to get into that. And before we do that, John, I wanted to just give you a quick intro. My name is Jason Matthias. For you, those of you who don't know me or haven't seen me before, my wife Shannon and I have 7 kids from the ages of 16 down to 5. And give me a second here. I think I have a problem with my slides. Yeah, somehow the slides got put out of order. Sorry about that. Okay. So a few extra seconds of looking at my beautiful kids and wife. Without further ado, let's continue. We are the family that started Seeds Generations about 6 or 7 years ago. And it came out of a love for gardening and growing food and sharing what we know with others and sharing seeds with others. And so we've been doing this as a family business now for a few years, and it's something we really love. All the kids get involved not only in the garden and harvesting seeds, but processing them, packing seeds, filling orders, so on and so forth. We live in the mountains of Virginia on a wonderful homestead that the Lord provided for us, that some friends built about 20 years ago and that we inherited a few years ago. And when springtime comes along, we're all out there planting together, and this time of year we're harvesting together, and it's a very integral part of our family lifestyle, and it is for John as well. For those of you who have followed me for a while, you know about our family's return to the old paths and the documentary film I produced on that topic called Beyond Off Grid. I mentioned this in part because one of the things we did with the Beyond Off Grid project was we produced a bunch of online training, a bunch of webinars like this, and John was one of the presenters in one of those several years ago. So I'm glad to have him back on. If you haven't already learned about Beyond Off Grid and Return to the Old Paths, you can go to returntotheoldpaths.com to learn more. My friend John Moody is quite a guy. He and his wife have 5 kids, soon to be 6. And he is a husband and father, which is his first and foremost priority. He's the author of 4 books so far on homesteading and gardening topics. He's a popular homesteading speaker, and he's a farmer, small-scale sustainable farmer, and also a real food advocate. Worked for a number of years with the Farm Consumer Legal Defense Fund, leading that organization. And you may have different places. These are just a few of them. But we're very honored and excited to have John on to talk about beating the weeds without the hard work. So we are going to switch over to John's slides and let him get started. So thanks for joining us, John.
Hey, great. Thanks for having me, Jason. Yeah, we're finally getting close to catching up to all of you in terms of number of kids.
Yeah, John, I don't see your slides yet. Can you make sure that they're you're sharing them?
Great. So,
there we go. I see your screen.
Excellent.
All right, you're good to go. I'm going to mute myself, and you can go ahead and get started.
Great. So it's awesome to hang out with you all. So hope you're enjoying the foretaste of fall. Here in Kentucky, August is usually hot and dry, and we have been surprisingly wet and cool for August, which means that weed issues that we normally don't have this time of year have been a lot more, dynamic and prolific because, hot and dry stuff tends to slowly die off, and cool and wet means stuff grows by leaps and bounds. And as Jason said, we've been homesteading and farming for about a decade. Um, Unlike a lot of people who grew up homesteading or farming, we made this transition about 13 or so years ago. And that then 10 years ago, we purchased a piece of property. And I was so well informed about buying land that I somehow managed to buy a farm with soil not included. So that made things exciting. I was so stubborn our first few years here, since I borrowed a tiller from a neighbor and the tiller broke before the soil did. I decided that I was going to grow in cardboard boxes. So this was our first garden, very first year out on the farm, because I could not get anything to grow in the ground because our soil is so poor. I decided I would grow on top of the ground. And so this is our farm a couple summers ago. So we built some nice infrastructure. We're able to grow a whole lot of food. We built some beautiful soil. And it's just kind of nice. And in the midst of all of that, as we were building soil and learning to grow food and do other things, we ran into a little bit of a problem. And that was we were spending an enormous amount of time fighting weeds. So I built just this absolutely from scratch, gorgeous 6, 8, 10 inches deep, lovely soil for us to grow food in. But soil that likes to grow food also likes to grow weeds. And so, and this is just some awesome pictures of my family. As Jason said, we have 5 kids. They are currently ages, well, now we have 6 kids, ages 14 to minus 6 months roughly. Because in March, we'll be expecting number 6 to join us outside. And we grow a lot of food. We sell at a couple different locations up in a neighboring city. Especially my kids do that. So that's mostly their gig is growing food for sale, and my gig is growing food for the sustainability, safety of our family. We just grow a lot of different foods. We also kind of have specialized in sourdough over the last few years, so my wife has been teaching people that. And we've been growing elderberries for about 8 years, and we have a little family homestead business around elderberry. And that's just been fantastic. It's been fantastic seeing the growing interest in that food. And so we just, try and have fun, try and do productive, good things as a family. And one thing we discovered that is not productive is spending a lot of time fighting weeds. So similar to how I learned to grow soil from scratch, we had to figure out how to deal with weeds, from scratch. Because in my area, especially, everybody tills, everybody sprays, but beyond those two approaches to dealing with weeds, there wasn't a lot of really great information available for us to make use of. So I began to read and to study, and similar to how we kind of figured out how to, one of my favorite talks I sometimes gives at conferences is, 6 inches of soil in 16 months. So I figured out how can you build 6 inches of great growing soil in a little bit over a year. And then, that created the weed problem. So then I started doing work and research and figuring out how do we win against weeds without destroying the soil we're building and without resorting to all of these nasty, scary, unnecessary chemicals. So how do we win the war with weeds? And also, though, without just having like endless hours of back-breaking manual labor. And so, I want to give you basically, because it is just about fall, these are 5 things you can do this fall to get you in a better position going into next spring to have less time, less labor, and less problems with weeds. So this is just going to be a little pared down. These are just 5 things you can focus on going into the fall that'll really, really make next year better for you food growing wise. And the first one is ensure you don't get overrun this fall by weed seeds. I believe this quote is from Elliot Coleman, the very famous and well-deserved acclaimed farmer, where he once said, 1 year of seed is 7 years of weed. So again, especially because at least in our part of the country, it has been cooler. it has been wetter, um, it is just weed seed reproduction right now is through the roof because that cool weather in the fall signals to plants it's their last chance to make progeny. And so you need to do everything reasonable in your power this fall to not let all of these weeds that are wanting to go to seed drop a whole bunch of seeds into your growing spaces. So even if that means a bit more manual labor this fall, if you got to go through a growing space with a scythe and cut out all the seed heads off the plants and stuff, then even if it's a bit more manual labor now to get these seed heads out of your growing spaces, it's a worthwhile investment at this point to make sure you don't allow a great deal of seed drop into your growing spaces going into the fall and winter cycle. So you really want to do what you can to, make sure you don't allow the seeds to get back into the ground. The next thing you want to do this fall, because now is the right time to do it, is to start stockpiling mulches and the other things you're going to need, come spring for weed control. So now is the time. If you're a person who likes to do wood chips in your garden for weed control, or you're hoping to start using wood chips for weed control, or you want to use straw because it's, you can get good quality, clean straw. And by clean, I mean relatively, not just weed seed free, but also wheat or what other type of grain that was grown in it free. We mean that, but also with straw, we also mean clean, meaning grown without herbicides. I know quite a few gardeners and even a few farmers who ended up really badly derailing their growing spaces by getting straw that had herbicide residue that then negatively impacted their crops for a number of years. So I prefer wood chips. I will, for a few crops, on occasion use straw. And I've gotten some free wheat cover crop because of that. That wasn't always ideal, but that wasn't too bad to deal with. But especially with straw, you really want to make sure it's herbicide free. And on the wood chip side, the reason you want the wood chips now, and the reason you want to stockpile wood chips, is one, you need a fair amount of wood chips to really do a good job mulching in a fair sized garden. So if you have 1,000 square foot garden, let's say, you really need about 4 inches of wood chips to suppress weeds, to get like a 90% weed suppression. So that basically means you need 300 cubic feet of wood chips, which is a pretty fair amount. A yard is 27 cubic feet. So that means you're looking at, you're looking at 12, 13, 14 yards of wood chips. And because wood chips, fresh piles compress down, a fresh pile that's about 5 yards of wood chips, once you've allowed it to age, is really more like 3.5 yards of wood chips. So you're going to have some loss because you want the wood chips to age. So one reason you want to stockpile is you need a lot of wood chips. A lot of people just don't realize how much wood chips you need to get a good suppressing layer of wood chips on the ground and really do you some good in terms of weed control. But the other reason you want to stockpile them now is fresh wood chips can cause some significant problems with your soil and with your growing plants. So you really want to let them age for at least 90 or more days. I really prefer to let wood chips age a solid 4 to 6 months before we start applying them to growing spaces, unless we're using them on paths or in buffer areas. And so, and the reason they need to age is the wood chips contain a bunch of acids. Some of the more aromatic species of wood chips, like your cedars and your pines, where does pine sol come from? It, was originally derived from pine trees. That's an antimicrobial, a cleaner, very powerful stuff. Smells real strong. So you can imagine really fresh wood chips especially from certain species, can cause some significant problems in your growing spaces. And some of them also contain what are known as allopathic chemicals. So the most, commonly known is walnut, and especially the jugulin it contains. These are chemicals that can inhibit other plants from growing. So you want to get wood chips now and into the coming months so you can age them, not only because once they're aged, they also are then inoculated with various fungi that are really good for your soil. You avoid, pH and acidity issues if you age them properly, and you get rid of any of these chemicals that could cause you problems. And the big reason you want to get straw this time of year is if you wait until spring, it may not be available. So right now is when people in my area, their barns and their storehouses are overflowing with hay and overflowing with straw, and they're trying to get rid of the excess. So they want to move it. They don't want to have to store it. They don't even have space to store it. And that's another thing, because if you wait until spring to get straw, you might be buying bales that have sat out all, fall, winter, and into spring long. So the bales are waterlogged. They're really heavy. The straw is a lot harder to work with. It can be full of various molds and other nasty things that aren't a whole lot of fun. So I like getting my straw this time of year, getting it under cover, properly storing it for when I'm going to need it in the spring, because it can be harder to get good quality straw come spring, because that's when they start to sell out of it or run out of it. And that's also, then they're also months away from getting it replenished. So if you're going to take a biomulch approach to suppressing weeds, because, wood chips and straw basically work by cutting off sunlight and other resources from weed seeds. And so keeping them buried far enough down to where they don't break out of sleep and begin to germinate. It's an awesome approach for weed control. It is an awesome approach for building soil. It is an awesome approach to reducing the amount of water you need to use on your growing space. So beds that we properly mulch, especially with a wood chip mulch, and there's a number of studies that support this, they reduce the amount of watering we need to do over a growing season by 70 to 80%. So there's a lot of benefits to using mulches, especially in conjunction with other weed suppression techniques. They're going to build up your soil. If you put them down right, put them down thick enough, they're going to keep the weeds away. And they're going to save you a ton of trouble with water and stuff, especially if you're in an area that's drought prone, or if it's hard to get water to your growing spaces. And, in my opinion, you could just never have too many wood chips available on and around your farm. They're great for bedding animals. They're great for dealing with problematic spots in your pasture that need some remediation and some love. And they're just super fabulous for improving your soil and for growing a wide range of crops in, and making your labor less and making your yields more. And especially for a few types of crops, they just make harvest a breeze compared to other growing methods. So if you can stockpile wood chips, you can stockpile straw. Now is the time to do it. And the big thing I always try and explain to people is, dealing with weeds is like a war. And either you are going to claim the space in your garden for you and your side, or nature is going to claim it for their side. So uncovered ground is basically you're signaling to nature and weeds that you want them there. So, I would say you want to go green or go brown, or you really want to go both. You want to control 100% of the space in your garden. You want to be the one deciding what is happening in every single square inch, whether that is a crop you're going to eat, a companion crop, a cover crop, or a mulch, or my preference, doing all of these together in various ways. Cover cropping, companion planting, undercropping, and mulching all together to really densely take up all of that space as best you can. So one thing people who come and take some of our on-farm classes are always amazed about is just how aggressively and densely we're mulching and planting and filling in our growing spaces, because we want to lay claim, to every last square inch is ours, so that the weeds don't think that there's any room for them. And one last reason I just mentioned, mulches, and why they're so great is because they really make beautiful growing spaces. I just, a cover crop is beautiful. A mulched area is beautiful. But, bare ground is very, very rarely beautiful in a garden. It's mucky. It gets full of weeds. It gets rutted. It cracks in the summer sun and in the heat. It gets dusty. It spreads diseases to your plants. And so mulch helps just make your growing spaces not only more resilient and more productive and less weedy, but just the aesthetic of it is beautiful. And it's also so nice with mulches, just on a practical level, to be able to wander around your garden even after heavy rains and not get all mucky, all muddy, and track that, into your house or all over whatnot. So stockpile mulches, they will make your life so much better. So third task, now is the time to cover crop. So now is the time, if you have beds that aren't being planted to fall crops, or just kind of any extra spaces that you're not making use of, now is when you want to get your cover crop game in order to, get all of the various benefits that a cover crop can give you. And one of the great things is, if you're someone who is having a hard time getting mulch, so it's really hard for you to get wood chips, it's really hard for you to get straw, well, you can grow your own mulch. You can grow a thick, heavy cover crop and let it get winter killed, and then come down in the spring and sigh it down right in place, a month or so before you're going to plant, and then plant right into your own homegrown mulch. And it's a fantastic system. I think there's actually a farmer in Virginia who grows potatoes that cover crops each fall, and they have a beautiful roller crimper machine they use for this. And they roll crimp it in the spring, and then they built a potato planter that plants the potatoes right underneath the freshly roller crimped cover crop that they grew that fall. And the cover crop provides a lot of the fertility for the potato crop. So cover crops, if you're not familiar with them, are fantastic. They improve your soil. So again, they put roots down in, the roots die. That provides space for air, for the soil food web, for water. So they help build organic matter. Another very important thing cover crops do, a lot of people harvest out, going into late summer, early fall, they harvest out their garden. It's a bare moonscape going into the fall. We get all these heavy fall rains going into the winter, and they have all of this terrible erosion moving and coming out of their garden. And all of that hard work of amending and building soil gets washed right away. And cover crops are just tremendous at helping protect growing spaces from needless soil loss and soil movement. Cover cropping done right is fabulous at suppressing weeds. Again, this goes back to the principle of, we want to claim every square inch of a growing space as ours. So if you don't want to grow something there, don't just mulch it, but double up and mulch it and then cover crop it. And so, as I mentioned, then, you can use a cover crop to have a mulch in place for a spring bed that you just need to mow down or sigh down or otherwise knock down. Just make sure you're planting cover crops that will frost kill over winter for you. Because on occasion, I know people who have planted cover crops going into the fall, and they chose cover crop varieties that won't fully frost kill for their area. And then they come back in the late spring thinking they can just mow them down or sow them down, and they start growing again. And then they're trying to figure out how to like get rid of this aggressive cover crop come spring. So just make sure you choose appropriate cover crop for your location. I can't really tell you what's best for your location because you all are probably from all over, and there's all sorts of great cover crop charts out there, including some I think that are in my book or some I link to from in my Winning Against Weeds book. And you got to choose ones that are right for your growing zone. So as I said, either you grow or they grow. So this is a picture of our high tunnel, and this gives you just a glimpse to how aggressively and densely we grow crops. On the far right of the picture, you see a row of young peppers that are now a whole lot taller. Next to the peppers, you see what remains of our spring fennel crop. And that's just, that's all about to be harvested out as we go into the warm sun. In between all of these things is a cover crop of red clover that was just covered in pollinators and all sorts of awesome beneficial insects. A lot of people, they deal with such bad aphid and other pressure. And we were counting this spring in our high tunnel about, half a dozen to a dozen aphid-eating beneficial insects per square foot living in and on the cover crop and other plants we planted. And then you see some cherry tomatoes coming up among the cover crop. We'll go back in there for the ones we want to keep and use a hand scythe, just cut around them to give them space, trellis them up so they live above the cover crop below. And then on the left, you see more netting for trellis crops like cucumbers, and over farther, even more cherry tomatoes. And in between the cucumbers and cherry tomatoes, earlier in the season, we had green beans. Then later in the season, we had basil. So either you grow or they grow, and you can grow so much more than most people realize in a small space, including growing your own fertility while you're growing your food. And it's just fantastic. So next task, solarize and oculate. Get rid of tomorrow's weeds today. So we are in the last couple weeks where you can, in most of the United States, successfully solarize. Solarization is basically using the incoming energy of the sun to superheat the top couple inches of your soil to kill off weeds and sterilize weed seeds. It is one of the most effective weed seed bank eradication tools that you can find. And so basically all it takes is some high quality greenhouse grade plastic. And you need sufficient soil moisture. So your soil has to be wet. It can't be super dry to solarize properly because you need the thermal mass and the thermal transference of the water. So, think of a microwave. Microwaves only work on things that have moisture content. If there's no moisture content, the things won't heat up properly. Same deal with solarization. So you need a good, high quality piece of greenhouse plastic. You need proper soil moisture. You need to clean the area well to make sure you're not going to put holes into this plastic with, old vegetative detritus or sticks or whatnot. And typically speaking, when you solarize, you bury all the edges of the tarp. So that's the proper way to solarize, especially if you have really, really heavy weed pressure. You really, really need to bury all the edges of the tarp. I'm kind of lazy, and so I strip solarize often when I'm going to go back through and mulch anyway, just to kill off stuff that's annoying or stuff that could possibly become annoying, especially when it's really, really young. I might quickly strip solarize for a few days. But especially if you're dealing with a really, really weedy space, you want to bury all the edges of the tarp and you want to let it stay tucked up, nicely installed for about 10 to 14 days with the highest temperatures and as much sunlight as the Lord might send your way. And so solarization is fantastic. Oculation, which I did not have a chance to pull a slide for, is similar to solarization, but instead of using clear plastic, you use something like a silage tarp. So some kind of heavy duty, dark colored tarp that will not allow sunlight to pass through and make contact with the soil. And whereas solarization kills weeds and weed seeds through heat transference and raising the temperature, oculation does it by strangling and smothering them into submission. So under an oculation tarp, it's warm under there, it's moist under there, and that makes weed seeds go, hey, it's a good time to germinate. And so they germinate under this heavy, dark tarp that allows no sunlight through, and they germinate, and then they just die, and they die back. And so oculation is really great because if you're somewhere where you don't have enough daylight left or enough heat left to successfully solarize, you can just move straight over to oculation. Or if your growing spaces are tied up still with plants that you're not going to be harvesting until September or October, you can oculate right through the winter and tarp down the areas. One major difference between oculation and solarization, if you have a lot of rodent pressure, underneath oculation tarps is rodent heaven. And so you really want to make sure that you have good rodent control measures in place if you're already having rodent problems and you want to try oculation versus solarization. So now's the time to really begin to knock out these two methods. We are solarizing off a few strips in our growing spaces, getting ready for fall planting, or just getting ready to let them get cover cropped going into spring. And we'll be doing some oculation as well over winter and into late spring. Another benefit of oculation, because it does warm the soil, is it'll give you a head start come spring on warming up soil. And one last thing I'll say about oculation, you can do it a number of times. So you can oculate an area for like 45 days, roll back the tarp, let it be exposed to wind and weather and whatnot, spread the oculation tarp again, and repeat the process a few times. And in between, if you want to get rid of more weed seeds, you can lightly cultivate the area to turn up additional weed seeds and further reduce the soil seed bank through this technique. So another thing you can do, always nice. And the last thing that you really want to do is you need to improve your growing plan for next season. Now is the time to kind of sit down and say to yourself, what crops were my problem crops? Why were they problematic for me to grow? And what do I need to do differently on a crop by crop basis and maybe on a crop flow basis? What are the changes I need to make proactively before I get knee deep in next season where I'm trying to start seeds and, I have so many other things going on. But, now into this fall is where you need to have that assessment with you and your family. What worked, what didn't, what were the real problems we faced. So you can invest energy now in having a good game plan going into next spring to up your growing game and not have these problems and headaches. So just going to show a few more slides and, talk about some of this. Sweet potatoes, such a fabulous food to grow. And, one thing I talk about in the Winning Against Weeds book is you need to figure out what weed suppression techniques work best with what crops and what kind of flow from crop to crop lets you, keep beds in protection and keep weeds away. And so, like, take sweet potatoes or potatoes. These are two crops. On the potato side, they respond so well to a heavy wood chip mulch for mulching them in and hilling them in, and then to really heavy companion planting. So we'll plant potatoes, and right next to the potatoes, we will plant onions or green onions or something. And we will then, among the green onions, maybe interplant bush beans, this really tight planting pattern right around the potatoes. For the sweet potatoes, because potatoes grow up, sweet potatoes grow out, we're going to mulch them in, but then they're going to become their own cover crop. And if you plant the sweet potatoes with enough initial organic mulch around them, I think we've pulled from around this 2,000 some square foot bed of sweet potatoes. I've had to pull over 3 months, probably maybe a dozen to a dozen and a half weeds from 2,000 some square feet. Because between the mulch that kept the weeds at bay at the beginning of the sweet potatoes getting going, and then the sweet potatoes themselves becoming a mulch, it just totally cuts down on your labor and your work for a crop like that. And so this is what we've done is we go kind of crop by crop, and we figure out what is the best flow and what is the best strategy for us to grow the maximum amount crop-wise with the minimum amount of work, weed and otherwise. And again, weed strategies, they work great for flowers. We usually put in a solid 2,000 to 2,500 square feet of flowers each year, because this is going to help you in terms of pest control and all sorts of other problems in your growing spaces. And flowers are just awesome. And they're also going to increase your yields because of the pollinator attractor factor that they're going to bring to what you're doing. So weed strategies apply not just to your vegetables, they apply to your flowers, they apply to your herbs, and they also apply to your perennials. And again, though, you're going to have to tailor your weed techniques to the crops you grow and to your particular growing approaches. Because obviously, like heavy wood chip mulches, we found don't work real well with crops like carrots. They work really well, though, with crops like potatoes. Or they don't work really well for seeding really fine seeded crops like lettuces. But wood chip mulches work great for plug and other types of lettuce transplants and cabbage transplants and stuff. So you'll need to figure out the workflow and the weed technique selections that really work best for your location, your soil, and the particular crops you really like to grow to make your life so much easier. So we're going to open it up for Q&A. This is that same picture of that fennel. So this is a ground picture of where that fennel was, where those cherry tomatoes were, and the peppers would have been on the right. So this gives you an idea of just how densely we grew out that space. Also at the far end of that space, there's a bunch of perennial chives and other herbs that come back at the end of the tunnel every year. So this is a great juxtaposition just to, show practically how you can grow a ton of food and control the weeds by growing your own fertility all at the same time, even in real tight spaces. So I hope you all, because of this webinar and just because of the work of Jason and others, have an even better 2020 growing season, 2021 growing season. And at this point, we're going to take some Q&A.
Hey, thanks so much, John, for an awesome presentation. I'm sure we have a ton of questions. Last slides here. So there's a Q&A box on the side of the screen that you can enter your questions in. If you haven't already done so, you can do that now. Real quick before we start taking questions, just wanted to tell you a little bit. What John covered today only scratches the surface of what's in his book. It is phenomenal. He's got a very well organized and laid out compendium of weed control information. So if you want to get his book, you're going to get really a way to get more food per square foot with less work, because weeds are typically the thing that make it difficult for us to grow more food. It's the thing that takes our time, as John will show you, unnecessarily. And we want to reduce that amount of work so that we can really focus on optimizing and growing more than we have. So you can learn all of the techniques to properly solarize, oculate, mulch weeds till they're essentially non-existent, as John has basically achieved at this point. One of the great things about the book is there's some great guides, quick reference guides and charts in the back that really help you understand like what times of year you need to do what things, and the proper methods to use given certain circumstances. And this is not just something that John wrote and then just threw out there. He's gotten feedback from lots of professional farmers, small growers, as well as homesteaders and gardeners. And he's gotten some great feedback on the book, including the fact that it's really a compendium of weed control methods, and it's easy to understand and apply to any farm or homestead or garden, depending upon whatever situation applies to you. So in the book, there's great information. Each chapter is very logically organized, but then in the back, it has basically quick reference information. So all the stuff that is in written form in the book is essentially in quick reference form in the charts and tables in the back. So once you've read the book, then you can always go back and look in the back when you need to apply the information. And I found that it's just super helpful the way he's laid everything out. So you can get the book on our website. There's a banner graphic below the video you can click on, or you can go to seedsgenerations.com/warrenweeds to find out more. We've also got some other really popular gardening books, one by Melissa Norris called The Family Garden Plan, and a really awesome canning book that just came out this year called the Homestead Canning Cookbook. And we've been selling a lot of these. People really love them. They, in similar ways to John's book, really lay out information in a very logical, easy to understand format and have great reference tables and charts to use. And so we decided to offer all three of these in like a special book pack. And that's part of our back to school sale that starts today and goes through to the next week. So you can click on the back to school sale banner or go to seedsgenerations.com/back to school. And let me see here. Last thing, let me check sure that I've got everything covered. Okay. Yeah, so the other thing about the back to school sale is that we're doing a special offer where if you order $40 or more of seeds and use the code back to school 40, then you'll get our premium fall planting calculator for free. It's normally a $10 tool that we have. And basically what the fall planting calculator does is you input your first average fall frost date, and it'll give you the latest planting dates for all the major crops that gardeners grow. And the premium version also, besides the fact that it's downloadable and you can print it out and stuff a lot easier than the online version, it also has dates in there for if you're using season extension methods. So if you're using row covers or cold frames or something like that. So a lot of people found that really helpful, and that's part of our back to school sale promotion as well. All right, so we're going to do questions now, and let me pull up my list of questions and we'll dive right in here. All right, so the first question is from Deborah. Here we go. And she says, I live in the desert, which is supposed to have very alkaline soil. Last year, before I knew I'd be gardening, I had so many weeds that I put baking soda over my whole backyard in the hopes of killing all the weeds. a lot less weeds did come up this year, but now my soil must be super alkaline. Has also made the soil more sandy and less hard. Any suggestions on how to fix that pH mistake and to keep desert weeds from overtaking everything? What do you say, John?
Well, the first thing is do not assume the pH of your soil. You need to do an actual soil test. So I always tell people without a test, it is just a guess. And I've known people who assumed their pH was something and thus began to apply amendments and whatever to their soil, only to find out to their later sorrow that they incorrectly assumed what their soil pH was. So the first thing you have to do is get a soil test, because until you have confirmed your suspicion, you're really getting into dangerous territory, throwing stuff at your soil without actually knowing its condition.
Yeah, that's great advice. I think you've mentioned that the soil test in like every presentation I've ever heard you give. So
Yeah, well,
here,
yeah, it just kills me because they're really inexpensive and they will just save you so much money and so much heartache. So there's just no reason not to do a soil test.
yeah. Do you recommend the kits that you can get either through a ag extension or there's some online vendors that sell them as well, and you send them in to get the results?
Well, normally what I recommend for most people is usually your extension center office, wherever you are across the country, offers soil testing. So you basically pull samples, you put them in the soil testing bags, and you drop them off at your extension center office and pay. And then, a few weeks later, you get your results in the mail. So especially just unless you want to pay more to use an independent lab, or one of the more formal soil testing services, for most of us, the Ag Extension Center soil testing, which, they'll send the samples on generally to one of the close by land grant universities. So like here in Kentucky, everybody's soil samples get sent to the University of Kentucky Soil Test Lab, which is at the university. And so that's fine for most of us, unless because of, either because you really want a lot more data, or you want to support an independent soil testing option. You can go with one of those, or you can just use your local extension service.
Great, thanks. Andrea asked, is there a resource or tool for identification of weeds when they're young and easier to pull? And I think this is a great question because a lot of times when people are searching for weeds, the pictures they find are of the mature weeds, and obviously
Yes.
easier to pick when they're young. So what do you say?
Well, there are phone apps that, as the weeds get younger and younger, will be of varying accuracy. So, the problem you're just going to run into, honestly, is a lot of different plants look very, very similar when young.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just tell people you need to learn your plants. Um, so, even my 9-year-old at this point, in the spring, can look down in our garden or in our high tunnel and easily identify the 20 or 30 different plants that generally come back each year. And he can really quickly and easily tell which are grasses, which are clovers, which are herbs, which are tomatoes. And so my suggestion is you should develop that skill, because, most likely you're really only dealing with, 20 to 40 plants. And so you should get good at identifying those main 20 or 40 plants that are part of your growing biosphere, and get to know them really, really well from seed, to full grown plant. Um, because again, there's just really, really young plants across a wide variety of families and other places just look so similar, that no guide is really going to be able to give you clarity like you developing experience, and developing that good eye, to learn and tell the difference for the limited number that you're going to be interacting with.
Yeah, that's great. Have a few questions about specific weeds here. Vicky asks about how if you know how to get rid of bindweed.
So, bindweed, depending on your soil, can be successfully solarized off. Um, so, some of these things like bindweed and stuff, it's best to avoid having them, because once you have them, it is a war, and you're going to really have to expend some energy getting rid of them. And one of the other problems with bindweed and some similar ones is, people tend to knock it back out of their growing space, but they haven't knocked it from along the edges of the growing space. And so it's a constant insurgency, back in. So, sedge is very similar, where, people will, get sedge knocked out of their growing beds, but they only knock it back to the edge of the growing beds. And then, it re-infiltrates every year. And it's like constant guerrilla warfare, along the edges of their garden. So one thing I say with things like bindweed or sedge is you really want to go an extra 10 feet, in all directions of your growing space, and knock it out, basically create a no man's land or a buffer zone, to really, protect and get it knocked out. So you could try solarizing it depending on your location and soil type. And you might have to solarize a good bit longer, like 30, 45 days of solarization to really, really cook the stuff out of the ground. And then, you're going to want to apply some beneficial microbes and other things after such a severe solarization, and cover crop it immediately and see if that won't help you get on the other side of it.
Yeah, that's great. Great advice. So a couple of people asked about Bermuda grass, and one person says they live in Arizona and it grows year round because there's no seasons there essentially other than hot and less hot. So, uh, what about Bermuda grass?
Yeah, I think solarization will kill Bermuda grass. And because you're in Arizona, where it's really, really hot, solarization should be a great tactic for just, you know, again, tarp the area and just cook the stuff down and off. And then once you've thoroughly, thoroughly killed it, down to that 4, 5, 6 inch depth level in the soil, then aggressively re-amend, re-help the soil, get it back into being happy and whatnot, and then don't let the Bermuda grass get established again, in the growing spaces, so that you're not having to deal with more mature plants.
Yeah, that's good. Couple questions about cover crops in desert climates. So when Linda says that she lives in Southern California and is asking for a good cover crop because it doesn't freeze there, and somebody else asked about growing cover crops in the desert, if that's better than wood chips. So what about cover crops in desert climates?
So I personally don't have a lot of experience in desert climates, um, living in Kentucky, which is like generally living waiting for Noah's Ark to show up part of the year and rescue us from the humidity and the rain. Um, so you can cover crop in desert climates. It's very beneficial to your soil. You're just going to want to look for someone, who has done research on the best cover crops for desert climates. And so The person I follow as a cover crop researcher is Steve Diver out of the University of Kentucky. He has a bunch of great resources on his Facebook page. I think he has some presentations up on YouTube and a few other places. But I don't know if he's done any research on desert climates. So I will, ping him after this and see who he would say is like the go-to person for good information on desert climate cover cropping strategies. So, because desert climates are, and by desert climate, do we mean just low rainfall, or do we also mean sandy soil? Because solarization is less effective on sandy soils. Because again, sandy soils don't hold water well, so you don't get nearly as good as heat transference and thus, weed kill and seed sterilization as you do on silty, loamy, clayey type soils. Wood chips are fabulous in lower moisture climates. I have not seen good studies on wood chips on sandy soils. And so that doesn't mean there's not good research on using wood chip on sandy soils. I just, in my research over the years, have not seen that. If it's out there, doesn't mean it's not out there, because there's so much stuff out there that no one can ever hope to catch it all. If I was in a sandy soil desert type area, but I could still get my hands on wood chips, I would basically do some trials with them and, use them in half of my garden and see how that half does versus the other half, and see what it does, to the soil moisture levels and to the plant growth and other things. Because this is one of the big challenges with gardening and with food growing is if anybody ever tells you that their strategy works everywhere, then they're almost certainly lying, because we all have different rainfall and soil and, particular plant species and variations of those species we're dealing with, and chill hours and daylight hours. So whenever I give advice, I do it in the way Tolkien describes how the elves give advice. They're very slow to give unguarded, unqualified advice. And so the best thing I can do is give you ideas for things you can try and the best ways to try them, and see how they work for you. Because that's the real test of any method. And that's why in my book, I lay out dozens of different methods, because just not every method is appropriate for every person.
Great, thank you for that. A couple people asked about wood chip alternatives. One asked about sawdust, and the other about pine shavings as substitutes. What are your thoughts on those?
So sawdust, absolutely not. Sawdust is not wood chips. Sawdust does not behave like wood chips. Wood chips allow moisture and air to still circulate and other stuff. Sawdust basically becomes like a hard, compacted mat on the soil. Wood chips, as long as you don't till them into the soil, do not result in changing the soil pH. They do not result, in nitrogen drawdown in your soil. Sawdust absolutely does. And the other problem you have with sawdust, unlike wood chips, is sawdust in really heavy rains moves around. So I had people over the years be like, well, I just use sawdust in my paths. And most of the people I know who do that until they get really bad heavy rains, because then all the sawdust in their paths ends up in their beds. And then now they have beds that are full of all of this sawdust. And then when they have to turn beds over, they're incorporating the sawdust down into the soil. And so now they're having to apply extra nitrogen to deal with the nitrogen drawdown from all the sawdust. So I don't like sawdust as a mulch. Now, if you have a really, really poor section of garden that's really, really weedy, or you have a really poor section of soil that's really, really weedy, that you eventually want to turn into a garden, and you have access to sawdust, man, bury that section 12, 18 inches deep of sawdust, fence it in, and put 20 chickens in there for 6 months. And that's a fantastic use of sawdust. And the chickens are going to aerate, and it's just going to be amazing soil when you're done. But trying to use sawdust as an active mulching strategy in the middle of an established garden, in my opinion, is just a recipe for all sorts of unhappiness. Pine needles, I talk about in the book, they're great. If you have access to those, they absolutely work well. They're not, I believe, as nourishing for the soil. So they're not going to get you the same amount of soil building benefits that wood chips provide and some of the other benefits of wood chips. But if I didn't have wood chips and what I had were aged pine needles, I would absolutely use them. And I would just keep an eye on my soil test results over time, just to make sure that they were not altering the pH in a way, and if they are altering the pH, it's not that I'd stop using them. I would just figure out what is the proper, balancing mitigation strategy. If the pine needles are slowly dropping my pH, what do I need to do growing wise or amending wise, to balance out their impact on the soil.
Great, thanks. Maryland. Oh, I actually skipped one here. I don't have a name, but it says, any thoughts on dealing with wild blackberries taking over the garden? I'm assuming having root pieces underneath that are popping up. So solarization again.
Well, again, this goes back to like, um, if you had an area that was wild blackberries already, and then you basically mowed it down and tried to turn it into a garden, you try to take over enemy occupied territory without rooting out all the insurgents first. So the first thing is, um, especially with some of these things like blackberries or other stuff, you really want to not let them gain a foothold or knock them out before you establish the garden. So if you're dealing with mature plants, we had a side of our garden that was all blackberries. And I didn't really like the species we were growing there. And so they were just kind of annoying. So we mowed them down 4 or 5 times, and then we solarized the area twice, separated by a few months. And we've had to pull maybe a dozen or less, blackberry things that popped back up, but it hasn't been overly hard to handle. Um, you know, but obviously that area, because we were mowing it and then solarizing it and then mowing it again and whatnot, um, it was out of commission. So, because if you have a lot of blackberry or a lot of raspberry or some type of that pressure coming up in a growing space, if you really want to knock it out without resorting just to manual pulling, you're going to have to lose the space for a time. But that's generally, if I have a space that has these shallow rooted perennials, because that's what we're talking about here, a shallow rooted perennial. I'll mow it repeatedly and then I'll solarize it, because solarization is really, really excellent against shallow rooted perennials.
that's great to know. I'm going to be buying more plastic very soon. I got some blackberries I got to get rid of.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, we had a creeping Charlie infestation because our blackberries came with some creeping Charlie. And I was
uh,
like, oh, that's cool. It's kind of edible. It's really pretty. And then, like, so the first few years, the creeping Charlie just kind of chilled underneath the blackberries. And then the creeping Charlie just became an unstoppable wall of green growth spreading across our entire garden. Um, and a bunch of people are like, oh, they're just like, you're going to have to spray that with something. And man, like solarization just immediately knocked it out. Just absolutely perfectly effective against some of those vining, creeping, shallow rooted stuff that is otherwise so hard to get rid of.
yeah, that's great. Marilyn asks if you can. She says, "Can you mulch your tomatoes and potato plants in at the end of the year?" I think that she means, can you like basically take the remaining plant material and till it in? Is what I'm guessing she's asking.
Well, I never till, so um, I don't ever till. Um, Not to say I wouldn't ever till, but 95% of the time, when someone tells me why they're tilling and we talk through why they're tilling, they realize there's no reason for them to be tilling. And so they don't till. Um, you know, Tillage is like the hamster wheel of food growing. You know, you're putting out a lot of energy and not getting anywhere. Um, and so we never ever till stuff. Uh, it just, when we harvest out potatoes or sweet potatoes or other crops, unless the crop debris is diseased or pest ridden, it just gets thrown right on top of the bed to rot down. Um, there is a good study I think I might mention in the book where the authors showed that tilling cover crops actually resulted in much lower nitrogen and organic matter gains than just crimping or killing the cover crops on the surface. Um, and if you till stuff in, you're now making your soil so much more prone to erosion and other problems. Um, so I just like, as a general rule of thumb, tillage is bad for your soil. It's really bad for weed control. It has very, very few benefits and very, very few times that it's necessary or makes sense to do. And so just let crop residue do what it does in nature and die right on the surface of the soil and feed the soil.
Right. So in this case, if the tomatoes or potatoes have blight on them, obviously you want to remove those. But if they were blight free, you could basically just put them down and then put mulch over them, let
Yeah.
them compost in place.
Yeah, exactly. And even if they do have blight, depending on how bad it is and whatnot, um, you know, you can remove the crop residue and burn it, but you already have the blight in the soil. So I probably need to go do more research on this, but years ago I began to just ask people, and I never got a really good answer. Um, is if the blight is in the soil already, does it make any difference dropping the crop residue? Because it's not like removing the crop residue is going to do anything about the blight that's already there. And it's like, um, so in situations like that, um, I think you're better off to consider, if you're dealing with blight or other stuff, what crop rotations and what microbiological soil amendments in terms of making your own micro bridge sprays, the Korean natural farming. type stuff that is so awesome. What are those things we do to to outcompete the problematic bacteria and viruses that cause plant disease? So like if plants have a lot of squash bugs or squash bug eggs, clearly you want to pull those. But if a plant is diseased from a virus, that virus is probably already deeply embedded in the soil. And so removing the plant matter is probably not going to make much of a difference, in my opinion. But I'm willing to be corrected on that if there's evidence to show that I'm wrong.
Gotcha. Leslie asks, she said, you mentioned using thick mulch about 4 inches. Do we need to avoid having the mulch in contact with the plant stems? If the mulch is touching the stem, won't it tend to hold moisture up against the stem and promote disease?
Yeah, you don't want to. It depends on the crop and other factors because, like radishes and some other things, they're going to push the mulch away themselves. I found, with potatoes, sweet potatoes, I mean, we bury our seed potatoes in the mulch, completely, not an issue whatsoever. Um, so, maybe with some of your longer growing things like cucumbers, tomatoes, and peppers, you might not want to mulch right up to the stalk. But I generally mulch right up to the stalk, and it's not an issue. And now, one situation where mulch can be harmful rather than helpful is if you have soil that tends to be waterlogged. Heavy wood chip mulching can basically turn your garden into a bog. And so you really need to think through, and I talk about this in the book. Um, if you want to be able to use mulches to both improve the soil and control weeds, but your growing area deals with a really high water table, or whatever reason it just tends to be overly wet already, um, how are you going to basically permaculture that area to balance the moisture issue so that the addition of the mulch doesn't create problems for yourself?
Gotcha. Okay. I just want to take a couple more here. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, but I'm trying to kind of combine some. So I have several questions related to weeds that have runners, and you kind
Yeah,
of already
rhizome.
answered that.
Yeah.
So solarization typically for perennial runner type.
Yeah. For shallow rooted running plants, um, again, don't let them get established in the first place. Um, if they are established, repetitive mowing on like a 12 to 20-day interval. Because with with rhizome reproducing plants, the problem is they've stored a bunch of energy in the root system. And so with thistle, with sedge, with some of these other rhizome runner type plants, they have a lot of built up resources. And so what you need to do is mow them repeatedly for a few months. And you always want to mow um, right at that regrowth point where they go from expending energy on regrowth to being able to restore the energy they depleted in the regrowth. So you don't want to mow them when they're only 1 inch tall again. But you want to wait until they're 3-4 inches tall, give or take, depending on the species. So they've reached that point where they've had to use up a bunch of root energy to regrow what you mowed off. And right when they're about to start saving up energy again, you mow them again. And then you do it again. And you thoroughly weaken them by, a number of mechanical mowing passes. And then you solarize them. So basically you hit them when they're down. You've used up a lot of the energy in their root system. You've really, really stressed the plant and that network of root system and their resources greatly. And now you hit them with solarization, and it's just generally game over.
That's great. I'm going to be implementing that some more myself. Someone asked, what do you do with weed seeds after you collect them?
I exile them to somewhere that they're needed. So we put them in buckets and we'll go dump them in degraded spots of the pasture or just go dump them somewhere where they, nobody will care about them or they will be welcome.
Okay. Let's see here. Jennifer asked, does solarization work well for raised beds?
It can. I know a number of people who use solarization for raised beds. If you're talking about like small, 4 by 8 foot raised beds, though, you really should be able to easily control weed problems in those by hand, unless you've done something crazy like used really weedy compost or something. Um, but yeah, I have a bunch of people who both oculate and solarize their raised beds.
Great. We'll make this the last one because it's probably a common question people have. Andrea says she had wood chips that were delivered in March in 2 loads. They haven't moved them, but she's wondering about to help them break down faster. Should they get stirred up? Give us a little bit info about like the speed of breakdown of mulch, both in piles, like if they get dumped, and then as well as the breakdown once they're spread out as mulch in the garden.
Yeah. So if you want them to break down more quickly, yeah, you can like turn the piles. Um, Sometimes my kids will want to turn the piles for fun, and I'll let them do that. But we never, for the most part, bother turning the wood chip piles because it's just, you know, they're going to break down whether or not you turn them. Yeah, it might take a little bit more time if you don't turn the piles. And that's why I get my wood chips, 6 months or so before I need them, because I don't want to have to manually turn big piles of wood chips. Another option with big wood chip piles is again, like putting them in with chickens or with pigs who are going to turn them for you. And then, having a 90, 180-day withdrawal after those animals have really turned and moved the piles around. Um, if you're selling food, because those are the FSMA rules. So I personally don't like having to do. There's so much manual labor um, that if I'm going to be doing manual labor, I want to be like doing productive manual labor, not turning a giant pile of wood chips. And so I find here in Kentucky, my rule of thumb with a wood chip pile is the smell and the see test is what I call it. If I can smell what type of wood it was, or I can see by looking at the wood chips what type of tree it was from, like I can look and I can tell this was a red oak, this was a walnut, this was a cedar, then the wood chips aren't ready yet. And this sometimes does mean, like with a pile of wood chips, we'll only take off the outside few feet, and the inside might need, another 30 days. So I use the see and smell test to know when wood chips are good to go and ready to be applied to the garden. And, once they're applied on the ground, I go over in the book, I have a bunch of charts that generally go over how durable different mulches will be. And so how long they're going to last you and how soon you're going to have to replace them. Because with wood chips, it really depends on both the species of the tree, the time of year you're applying them, the strength of your soils, fungal communities, and then the size the wood chips were chipped to, and the amount of green matter that was mixed in with the wood chips when they were chipped. So there's a lot of factors that impact the speed at which wood chips are going to decompose.
Okay, great, John. Thanks so much for a much longer Q&A session than I had anticipated, but there was a lot of great questions. I really appreciate that. Folks, we're going to wrap up. I appreciate you coming. Before you go, remember that you can get John's book. We have it on sale right now. Click the banner below the video or go to seedsforgenerations.com/Warren Reads. We've got all three of our most popular gardening books together in a pack for our back to school sale. So you can click on the link below to get that as well. And if you want to get that premium fall planting calculator, you just have to have a seed order of $40 or more and use that code back to school 40 and you can get them. So on behalf of John's family, thank you so much for coming to this presentation. Thanks, John, so much for coming. We really appreciate it.
Great. Well, I hope you and your family have a fabulous week, friend. We'll talk soon.
All right. Take care. Thanks. And thank you, everybody, for coming.